A girl in the snow was hiding something. His police dog found the truth. They found her sitting under a pine tree just past the edge of Granite Hollow, knees drawn to her chest, flurries melting on her lashes. No coat, no name, just two German shepherds curled tightly against her sides, ribs showing, eyes hollow, like they hadn't slept in weeks. She didn't speak when Officer Elias Rowe approached, just stared past him like she was still listening for someone who never came. His canine, Ash, didn't wait. He nudged her hand once, then lay down beside her, like he already knew. There was something else in her backpack. Beneath a folded hoodie, a hospital bracelet with a name that shouldn't have existed. That day wasn't about a rescue. It was about a memory that had been buried, a name that refused to disappear, and a girl who had survived something no child should. But what Ash sensed first wasn't fear, it was guilt. The last candle flickered in the kitchen of the house on Wren Hollow Road. Inside, warmth clung to the walls like a lie that hadn't yet been exposed. Balloons sagged from the chandelier, glitter stuck to the rug, and Ivy Bruner twirled in her new velvet dress, pink with pearl buttons, while her mother, Monica, handed out party favors with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At the edge of the hallway, barely visible in the golden light, stood Lyra. She wasn't supposed to be part of the party. She never was. The instructions had been clear. Stay upstairs, stay quiet, don't embarrass anyone. But Ivy had forgotten the scissors, and Monica had sent Lyra down, just for a moment, just to help. She never made it back up. The birthday girl's tablet had gone missing. One moment it was there beside the pile of gift wrap and plastic crowns, and the next it was gone. Ivy's voice had pierced the music like broken glass. "My tablet! It's gone! Someone took it!" Guests murmured. Monica's smile tightened. Her eyes swept the room until they landed on the only figure not meant to be there. Lyra, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, 2 steps from the couch. "It was right here," Ivy insisted, dramatic tears already blooming in her blue eyes. I think Lyra took it." The room hushed. Even the music faded to a throb in the background. "I didn't," Lyra said softly, but her voice didn't carry. It never did. Ash, the older pup, sensed it first. He stood from his kind, or at least less absent. But grief had hollowed him out years ago, and nothing ever grew back. "You know what?" Monica had said, loud enough for Ivy to hear from the top of the stairs. "I've had enough. Take your things, take your mutts, and get out." Lyra didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she had learned long ago that arguing only made it worse. Words were weapons in Monica's mouth, sharpened by grief, guilt, and something colder, resentment. In the narrow storage room where she slept, once a broom closet, she stuffed her small backpack with what she could. A worn notebook, the scarf her mother used to wear every winter, a broken pencil, a crumpled drawing of a pine tree. She folded her mother's sweater with deliberate care, tucking it beneath the drawing. Ash and Nara paced near the door, sensing movement, tension, departure. Ash let out a low bark, as if asking, "Are we really going?" Lyra zipped the backpack closed, Yeah, she whispered. I think we are. She paused only once on her way out. At the kitchen counter, untouched from the party, lay a bowl of candy. She didn't take any, not out of fear, just a quiet refusal to accept anything that wasn't given freely. The front door creaked. No one followed. No one called her name, not even Ivy. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the barren stretch of Red Fern's outer woods. Snow had begun to fall again, not violently, but steadily, like ash from a fire long burning. It dusted the trees, the mailbox with the chip number 17, the concrete steps Lyra descended, one at a time. Ash pressed against her leg. A burden. Some kids just come with too much baggage, she had once said, not realizing Lyra had been listening from the hallway. But Lyra didn't feel like baggage. She felt like something someone had simply forgotten how to hold. When they reached the turnoff from Ridgeway Pass to Pine Creek Trail, the snow was past her ankles. Her fingers were numb. Nara whined once, and Lyra stopped to scoop her into her arms. Ash didn't complain. He only leaned in closer. Ahead, she could see the outline of the old wooden bridge, long abandoned after a flood washed away part of the road. It was half collapsed now, leaning like a weary giant. But beneath it, there was shelter, a dry patch, just enough space for 3 broken things to survive the night. Lyra knelt, trembling, and laid her backpack down. Ash circled once, then lay at her back, pressing his body close to hers. Nara curled into the crook of her stomach. Together, they made a circle of breath and fur and fading warmth. The wind whispered across the bridge. Lyra pulled the scarf higher, shut her eyes, and whispered into the dark, "Please don't be mad, Mama. I'll be better. Just don't leave me too." The wind had teeth now. It nipped at the cuffs of Lyra's too small jacket, crept through the frayed seams of her jeans, and bit deep into the space between her shoulder blades, where her backpack straps had rubbed raw. The snow wasn't thick yet, not the kind that blanketed the world in peace. No, this snow was thin, sharp-edged, and angry. It blew sideways through the pines, needling her cheeks red and scraping across her lips until they cracked and bled. Ash walked close enough that his thick coat brushed her thigh with every step. Nara lagged behind, her ears flattened, paws dragging. Lyra kept glancing over her shoulder to make sure the smaller pup was still there. "Almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the bridge or something else entirely. Maybe safety. Maybe the end of whatever this was. The moon was just a smear behind the clouds now, barely enough to light the narrow path ahead. But she didn't need much light. Her legs knew this way by memory. 2 summers ago, her mother had brought her down Pine Trail to the bridge, back when it was still intact, back when the world still smelled like sun-warmed bark and blackberry jam. They'd laid out a thin quilt under the trees, poured lemonade into jelly jars, and counted dragonflies as they darted over the creek. Ash and Nara hadn't even been born yet. Her mom had been laughing that day, real laughter, the kind that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. Lyra had made her a crown out of ferns and clover. Her mom had worn it like it was made of gold. Now that same trail felt haunted. Wooden planks cracked and bent, one side collapsed in a slow, splintering bow. It had been condemned last fall, a yellow warning sign nailed crookedly to one support beam, the letters nearly rubbed out by weather. But beneath it there was shelter, enough maybe for a night. Lyra crouched down first, crawling on hands and knees over the frozen ground. It was mostly dry beneath the arch, just a scattering of old leaves and damp soil, hardened now into a crust by the cold. She took off her backpack, laid it flat, and sat on top of it. Ash came in next, tail sweeping low, checking the edges with the quiet efficiency of a soldier. Nara followed, pressing herself tightly against Lyra's hip, trembling. "Good job," Lyra whispered to her. "We're okay." But they weren't, not really. Her fingers were too numb to feel. Her legs ached with something deeper than cold, a heaviness that wrapped itself around her knees and refused to let go. She pulled the scarf up over her face, breathing through the wool. It smelled like lavender and firewood and the ghost of her mother's shampoo. Outside, the snow kept falling. She pressed her cheek to Ash's back, burying her face in his thick fur. His body was warm, solid. He didn't move, only shifted once, so his side covered more of hers. His presence said, "I've got you." Nara curled in tighter against Lyra's stomach, her nose tucked under her tail. Her small frame shuddered once, then went still. Only her ears twitched, catching every branch creak and gust of wind. Lyra wrapped one arm around each dog, her chin resting between their shoulders. Then she looked out into the dark and whispered. "Mama," she said, but it came out broken, like a breath falling apart. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words floated up into the blackness above them, snagged somewhere between snowflakes and silence. "I tried. I didn't even touch that stupid tablet. Ivy, she knew what she was doing. And Monica," her voice caught again, "she never wanted me. You were right. You were right about her." A gust of wind howled through the slats of the bridge. It sounded almost like a voice, drawn long and mournful. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, don't be mad at me." She didn't know who she meant anymore, her mom, herself. "I'll be better, I promise. Just don't leave me alone." The cold began to creep in then, not just around her, but inside. It slid through the fabric of her jacket, beneath her skin, into her ribs. It wasn't the sharp kind of cold anymore. It was dull, heavy, a slow erasure. She remembered learning in school that frostbite starts by making you feel warm again, like your body is giving up. She wondered if that's what this was. Ash shifted and licked her wrist. She could barely feel it. Nara made a sound. "I'm still here." She forced herself to sit up straighter. She hugged both dogs tighter, pressing her forehead to Ash's fur. His heartbeat was steady, real. As long as she could hear that thump beneath her ear, she wasn't gone. She reached into her backpack with stiff fingers and pulled out her notebook. The pages were curled from moisture, the cover bent at one corner. She opened it anyway. Inside were crooked drawings of trees, dogs, and stick figures with hearts above their heads. She found a blank page near the back and held the pencil as best she could. In block letters, she wrote, "If we make it through tonight, I'll draw you a real home tomorrow." Then she closed the book, slid it under her coat, and curled back down between the dogs. The wind howled again, but this time it sounded different, not cruel, not mocking, just tired. Lyra drifted in and out, her body trembling against the edge of sleep. But every time she began to slip, Ash would nudge her, just enough to remind her she wasn't alone. And so the hours passed, slow, bone deep, but together. 3 shadows huddled beneath the broken bridge, wrapped not in blankets, but in loyalty. And above them, the snow kept falling. The forest didn't speak much in winter. It breathed, maybe, groaned beneath the weight of old snow, let its branches creak like tired joints, but it didn't speak, not unless you'd been listening long enough to hear the difference between a sigh of wind and a cry for help. Elias Rowe had been listening a long time. His boots crunched methodically along the eastern trail, each footfall practiced and precise. The morning air was bitter, sharp enough to make his breath fog against the collar of his army fleece. The trail ahead was barely visible, half buried under the storm that had blown through the night, but his legs knew it by memory. His body moved the same way it had for years, forward, steady, clean. Discipline kept the silence at bay. At least most days. He didn't run for cardio anymore. He didn't care much about heart rates or mileage. He ran because the stillness that came after war was louder than bombs. He ran because his hands shook less afterward. He ran because ghosts didn't like cold air in their lungs. This morning, though, the silence felt off. He slowed near the ridgeline, one hand brushing against the low-hanging pine branches. The sun hadn't quite made it over the horizon, but the snow carried a strange light of its own, blue and silver, soft as breath. Something in his gut tightened. He stopped. There, not 20 yards ahead, stood two shapes in the trail. Dogs, one tall, thick-bodied, with a black saddle across its back. Ears perked, eyes locked on Elias like it had been waiting for him. The second was smaller, paler, trembling, tucked just behind the larger one's flank. They didn't bark, they didn't charge or flee. They just stood there, like guardians. Elias took one slow step forward. His pulse didn't rise, but his hand instinctively moved near his belt, where nothing hung anymore. No sidearm, just muscle memory. "Easy," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Where's your person?" The bigger dog, Ash, growled low, not out of aggression, but warning. Protective, trained maybe, or just smart. And then Elias heard it. A voice, soft as a leaf brushing snow, carried by the wind from somewhere beneath the ridge. "Please don't leave me." He turned sharply. It wasn't a sound made for the ears. It was made for the heart. And it cracked something in him open. He stepped off the path, following instinct more than sight. Branches tore at his sleeves, but he kept going, boots sinking into thigh-high drifts. The dogs moved ahead of him now. Ash, clearing the way like he'd done it before. Nara followed, stumbling once, but pushing on, and then he saw her. Under the old bridge, the one that had collapsed last fall, a small shape curled in the dirt, half covered by a worn backpack and two trembling bodies. A girl. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her face was pale, lashes crusted white from frost, lips chapped to the point of splitting. One arm was wrapped around the smaller dog. The other lay limp across the bigger one's chest. She didn't move. Elias crouched slowly, careful not to cast his shadow over her. Ash immediately rose to block him, chest low, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "Easy," Elias whispered again, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt her." He stayed that way, kneeling in the snow, unmoving, for nearly a full minute. Ash stared at him, measured him. Then, finally, the dog stepped aside. Just an inch. It was enough. Elias leaned in. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the girl's neck. There, a faint pulse. Weak, but there. He didn't speak. He didn't swear or panic or run. He just moved, deliberate, efficient. He peeled off his outer jacket and wrapped it around her first, lifted her with arms that remembered how to carry the wounded. The girl let out the tiniest sound. Not quite a whimper, not quite a breath. And her head slumped against his chest. Ash was already circling, herding, guarding. Nara licked the girl's hand once before trailing after. Elias didn't look back at the bridge. Whatever had happened here, whoever had sent this child into the woods with 2 dogs and no hope, could stay buried in that silence. His cabin wasn't far, half a mile, maybe less. Tucked beyond the junipers where no neighbors came knocking. He moved quickly now, his boots biting into the slope. Snow blew harder as he went, but it didn't matter. Inside his arm, bed still untouched since Rex died last winter. But it would do. It had to. Elias kicked open the door with his boot. Inside he laid her down on the old braided rug by the fireplace. Ash immediately lay across her feet, Nara curled against her stomach, ears twitching. Elias moved like a man with orders. Firewood, kindling, a match struck, Flame caught. Heat crawled out of the stone hearth like a promise. Then blankets, a warm pot of water from the kettle. He wrapped her gently, knelt again, and brushed a bit of ice from her eyebrow. She stirred. For the first time her eyes opened. They were the soft brown of tree bark after rain. Wide, clouded with cold, but not fear. She looked at him the way soldiers sometimes looked at medics, not with hope, but with relief. "Who are you?" she rasped. He hesitated, then answered simply, "Elias." A pause. Her lips barely moved. "Are you real?" "I think so." She blinked once. "Okay." Then her head dropped back into the blanket, and her breath evened out. Ash didn't move. Nara closed her eyes. And Elias Rowe, who hadn't let anyone past his porch in years, sat down beside the fire and whispered, "You're safe now, kid," and meant every word. The cabin had not seen warmth in months, not the kind that came from bodies, from breath, from the shuffle of small footsteps across the floorboards. For years now it had stood like a memory on the side of the mountain, still sturdy, still solid, but hollowed from within, like a chest that remembered how to beat but had long since forgotten why. Elias kicked open the door gently, his boots leaving heavy tracks across the porch. Snow clung to the hem of his jeans and melted into his socks, but he didn't stop to shed the wet. His arms were full. The girl stirred once against his chest, a low sound escaping her lips, somewhere between a sigh and a shiver. Elias readjusted her weight, careful not to jostle her too hard, and stepped inside. The air inside was biting cold, holding its breath like the rest of the world. It smelled faintly of cedar dust and cast iron. The hearth was dark. The curtains were drawn. The windows wore a thin glaze of frost, like sleep that had yet to lift. Ash was the first through the door, nosing past Elias's legs, ears forward, tail stiff with purpose. He scanned the room quickly, then moved to the front door and parked himself there like a sentinel. Nara followed slower, paws soft against the wood, her smaller frame trembling with both cold and something deeper, an instinct that said, "We've entered something sacred." Elias crossed the room in long, quiet strides and knelt beside the fireplace. He laid the girl down, permission yet to let go. He brushed the hair from her forehead. Then he moved. Years of soldiering had taught him how to act in silence, how to prepare a fire with one hand, how to warm a room before frostbite set in. The match caught on the third strike. The dry pine bark hissed, then bloomed into flame. He fed it slow, like waking something old. Within minutes the fire was alive, not roaring but steady. A low glow reached across the floor, illuminating the corners of the cabin with a light that had been missing for far too long. Elias turned back to the girl and unzipped her coat. He worked quickly, but not carelessly, removing her damp outer layers and wrapping her in 2 thick flannel blankets he retrieved from a wooden chest near the back wall. The blankets smelled of dust, pine, and thyme, but they were warm. They would do. Ash hadn't moved from the door. His eyes never left Elias. A silent agreement passed between them. "I'm watching you, but I trust you." It was enough. Nara crept across the floor, her nails ticking softly against the wood, and curled up against the girl's chest. Her nose pressed just beneath the edge of the blanket. Her body curved around Lyra's like a comma in a sentence that hadn't finished yet. Elias rose and went to the kitchen. It was small, tucked beneath exposed beams, with shelves made of reclaimed wood. There was no microwave, no fancy appliances, just a cast-iron stove, a kettle, and a small stack of chipped enamel bowls. He filled a pot with broth from a jar he'd canned last fall, chicken, rice, a few root vegetables, and set it over the flame. He watched the pot as it warmed, but his eyes kept drifting back to her, to the girl on his floor, to the stranger who had entered his life without warning and now lay cradled between two dogs, like a prayer he hadn't known he'd spoken. He didn't even know her name. He brought water to a boil in the kettle, filled a mug, and set it aside to cool. Then he ladled soup into a bowl, thick, fragrant, steaming, and carried it slowly to the hearth. He placed it on a wooden stool, just within arm's reach of her. The smell seemed to stir something. Lyra groaned softly, her lashes twitching. She turned her head toward the bowl, but didn't wake. "That's okay," Elias said quietly, kneeling beside her again. "We've got time." Time. It hit him suddenly how long it had been since he'd had time for anyone else. The cabin had been built by his grandfather, improved by his father, and abandoned by everyone else. After Faye left, yet, Ash turned his head and met Elias's gaze. "I know," Elias muttered. "I wasn't ready either." He moved the kettle off the heat, poured a second bowl of warm water, and placed it gently beside Nara. She lapped at it gratefully, eyes never leaving Lyra's face. The fire popped once, loud, sudden. Lyra flinched. Elias was by her side in an instant. "It's just the fire," he said softly. "You're okay." Her eyes opened then, slowly, dazed. She blinked up at him, then over to Nara, then to Ash at the door. "Where?" Her voice cracked. She swallowed. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Elias replied. "You're at my cabin. I found you by the bridge." She didn't answer right away, just stared at the ceiling like she was trying to anchor herself in reality. Finally, she asked, "Are you a policeman?" Elias shook his head. "No, just someone who goes running too early." A small breath left her, like the beginning of a laugh that never formed. "My dogs," she whispered. "They didn't let me get cold alone." "No," Elias said. "They didn't." He didn't ask who she was, or why she'd been out there, or what had driven a child to sleep in the snow with two pups as her only protection. He just sat beside her in the glow of a fire that hadn't burned in years and offered her soup and warmth and space. And somehow, in that quiet, the cabin seemed to breathe again. The world didn't return all at once. It crept back in quiet layers, warmth before sound, light before meaning. Lyra stirred beneath the heavy blanket, her face half buried in the soft flannel, the scent of smoke and pine hanging in the air. Her first instinct was stillness. In her short life, waking up in an unfamiliar place rarely meant safety. It meant explanations, accusations, movement before memory. So she didn't open her eyes at first. She listened. There was the sound of the fire crackling low, the quiet lap of water in a bowl, a kettle whistling softly, not boiling, just murmuring, like someone had taken it off the heat early, and beneath all of it, the rhythmic thump of two steady dog tails beating gently against the floor. Ash, Nara. She let out a breath, not relief exactly, but the closest thing her body could give. Then she opened her eyes. The light was gentle, amber, pulled from the hearth and spilled across the floorboards like honey. The rug beneath her cheek was rough but warm. Her fingers, still cold at the knuckles, curled instinctively into the edge of the blanket. Ash lay at the front door, upright, alert, as if he'd take the flames, eyes unreadable, as if turning over something heavy in his chest. He looked big, but not in a way that frightened her. He looked like someone who used to be taller. His beard was rough at the edges, salt in the dark brown. There were small cuts across his knuckles, not new, but not old enough to forget. His flannel shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and there was a burn mark just above his wrist that looked like it came from a muffler or a memory. She shifted. He looked up. Their eyes met hers, guarded but not hostile. His steady and low like river water. He didn't speak right away, didn't lunge for answers or launch into a speech. Instead, he simply said, "You slept a while. That's good." His voice was gravel soft, weathered, safe. Lyra blinked, then looked down at Nara. The dog stirred, licked her sleeve, then settled again. "You're at my cabin," the man said, gently. "You were out in the cold. I found you by the old bridge." She didn't respond. He didn't push. There was a bowl on the stool beside her. Steam curled slowly from its surface. Soup, still warm, chicken and rice. Her stomach ached as soon as she realized it. It had been, how long? 2 days? 3? Since she'd last eaten anything that wasn't dry or cold, or snuck from someone else's leftovers. She reached for the spoon, then hesitated. She looked at him. Still no questions. Only this. "It's yours. No one's going to take it away." She nodded. Just once. Then slowly, with fingers that barely obeyed her, she picked up the spoon and took her first bite. The broth hit her like memory. Warmth, salt, rosemary. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She blinked quickly and kept chewing. He stood, moved to the kitchen and returned with a metal cup of water. He set it down on the floor beside Nara, who sniffed, lapped, and then returned to her post like a sentinel in miniature. Lyra ate quietly. No slurping, no mess. Every bite measured, respectful, like she wasn't sure when the next would come. She didn't look up for a long time. When she did, it was only to whisper, "Can they stay?" Her voice was almost lost in the fire's rhythm. Elias sat back in his chair. He didn't patience. Outside, the light had begun to shift. The shadows on the wall leaned longer. The wind had died down, at least for now, and snow drifted in soft spirals against the window pane. Lyra lay back down. Nara shifted to fit the new shape of her body. Ash had moved closer, now lying between her and the door. She didn't sleep, but her eyes closed. Her hands rested on the scarf still wrapped around her neck. She pulled it once, just to be sure it was still there. Elias added another log to the fire. He didn't know her story yet, not all of it, but he knew the way her fingers had hovered over the dog's fur. He knew the way her first words hadn't been, "Where am I?" but "Can they stay?" He knew loyalty when he saw it, and he knew fear even better. She would talk when she was ready, or not. Either way, the fire would stay lit, and no one would take her dogs away. Not while she was under this roof, not while he still had breath to give. The fire had burned low, glowing like a tired heart in the dark. Outside the cabin, the wind had shifted, its howl replaced by the hush that came only after snowfall, when the world wrapped itself in silence and even the trees stood still. Inside, Elias sat motionless in the old rocker by the hearth, the wood creaking faintly beneath him. He hadn't spoken in over an hour, not since Lyra had laid her head back down and drifted into sleep again, her body curled in the crook between Ash and Nara, like a child returning to the only home she'd ever trusted. She hadn't told him her name, but he hadn't asked. Names were something sacred, he'd always believed. Like memories or scars, they came when they were ready. His eyes settled on the backpack she'd carried in from the bridge. It lay near the fire, damp at the corners, its faded fabric patterned with tiny stars and worn threads that had seen too many nights in the cold. He waited a moment longer, not out of hesitation but out of respect. Then, slowly, he stood. He moved like a man approaching something holy, not out of fear, but reverence. He crouched beside the pack and placed his hand on the zipper. His fingers hesitated there, hovering. He whispered low, almost apologetic, "I just need to know who you are, kid." The zipper caught once before sliding open with a faint rasp. Inside, the contents were neatly arranged. That told him something. A small notebook, its cover water-stained and bent at the spine. A half-used box of colored pencils with the red one broken clean in half. A folded flannel shirt that might have once been pink, now dulled by travel and cold. And tucked deep in a side pocket, protected like treasure, a small zippered pouch. He unzipped it. 3 items rested inside. A hospital bracelet, a photograph, a small envelope sealed with tape. His breath caught. Clara. Faye. The second name hit harder than the first, like a name whispered at a funeral, or a hymn you hadn't heard since childhood. Faye, he murmured aloud, barely breathing. His sister, the girl on the floor, Clara, was Faye's daughter. The fire crackled beside him, indifferent, but inside his chest the silence shattered. He sat back slowly on the floor, the bracelet still in his hand, staring into the hearth as if expecting it to explain something. But it didn't. It just kept burning, soft and low, casting shadows across the cabin walls like ghosts come home. He picked up the second item, the photograph. It had curled at the corners, aged into sepia tones that dulled the outlines, but the subjects were unmistakable. A woman in a hospital gown, dark hair clinging to her damp cheeks. Her smile was weary, but full, a kind of joy that came only once in a lifetime. In her arms, wrapped in a green blanket, was a newborn. Someone had written on the back in pencil, "Clara Faye Dawson, born 10/10. Welcome to the world. You are wanted." Elias's hands shook as he turned it over again. He hadn't seen Faye in almost 10 years, not since that last fight. She'd left in the rain with nothing but a duffel bag and the sound of his words still hanging in the doorway. "Then go, if you think you know better." He never saw her again. He told himself she was fine, that she'd moved on, that she'd landed somewhere soft. But now, he looked toward the girl on the rug. Clara. Her name was Clara. He didn't need a paternity test or a document. He could see Faye in the shape of her mouth, in the stubborn set of her brow, in the way she curled inward like a secret she didn't know how to tell. Ash stirred at the door. Not alarmed, just aware. Elias set the bracelet down beside the photo and picked up the final item, the envelope. It was sealed with duct tape. No name on the front, just a slight smudge of ink, as if someone had begun to write something, then stopped. He turned it over in his hands. It wasn't heavy, but it felt weighted. The last time he'd seen his sister, She was yelling at him for being too cold, too rigid, too much like their father. She'd been trembling, not from anger, but from disappointment. And he had stood there, silent, arms crossed, letting her go. This envelope had waited 10 years for him. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he stood, crossed the room, and pulled down an old wooden box from the shelf above the coat rack. Dust billowed from the lid. He hadn't touched it since his mother died. Inside were pictures, him and Faye as kids. He didn't need to read either one to understand what had happened. Faye had gone off to protect her daughter, to raise her far from the dysfunction they both came from, to try and build something better. And somewhere along the way, she'd vanished. And Clara had ended up in the snow with 2 dogs and a bag full of memories. Elias stared into the flames. There were no tears, not yet. Just a quiet shift in gravity, the kind of weight that comes when you realize the past you buried has found its way home, not through vengeance, but through a 9-year-old girl with frost-bitten lips and a scarf that smelled like lavender. He stood, moved to the girl, and placed the photograph beside her backpack. Then he sat back in the rocker and whispered, as if to the ghost of his sister, "I found her, Faye. I found her." And the fire kept burning. The photo sat on the table like it had always belonged there. It was curled slightly at the edges, time having softened its corners the way water rounds a stone. The ink had faded just enough to give it a sepia glow, but the emotion inside it hadn't dulled, not even a little. Elias stared at it in the hush of the early cabin light. The snow outside had settled into stillness, the kind that came only after a storm, as if the land itself had exhaled. But inside him, the storm was just beginning. In the photograph, Faye was sitting up in a hospital bed, her hair slightly damp, falling in wild waves over her shoulders. There were faint circles under her eyes and a crooked hospital bracelet around her wrist. But the smile, that smile was full and bright. It reached all the way into the corners of her eyes, the kind of joy you don't fake. In her arms, a baby, swaddled in a blanket the color of spring grass, round-cheeked and tiny, eyes shut tight against the world. The baby's hand rested against Faye's collarbone, as if they already knew each other in ways words could never describe. He'd seen this kind of photo before, online, in albums, on waiting room bulletin boards, but never like this, never with that face, never with her. He sat back slowly in the old wooden chair, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and ache. His thumb brushed the edge of the image, tracing over Faye's chin the slight dimple that only showed up when she laughed too hard. She was younger in this picture than he'd remembered her, or maybe he had just aged so much in the meantime that everything felt older by comparison. "You should have told me," he murmured, voice rough. "You didn't have to do it alone." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew he hadn't made it easy for her to told himself back then that it was for the best. That distance was cleaner than repair, that time would smooth the edges of whatever broke between them. But it hadn't. It had just made the silence harder to speak through. And while he stayed here, hiding in routines and frost-bitten mornings, Faye had gone and built a life, alone, with her, his niece, Clara, Faye Dawson. He said the name aloud, like a prayer, not to test it, but to release it, to admit it into the room. The fire beside him crackled softly, casting faint shadows across the photograph. In the warm flicker of light, Faye's face looked alive again. The way she had the day they built the swing in their mother's backyard. The way she'd looked the last time she'd hugged him, right before everything cracked. And now, she was gone. Elias didn't know when she had died, or how. The bracelet gave him her name, not her fate. But he knew what loss looked like. He'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers, in the quiet at the back of funeral homes, in the way children folded in on themselves when they realized no one was coming back. He saw that same folding now in the way Clara didn't ask for things, the way she kept her voice small, her presence smaller. She hadn't said her name because, somewhere deep down, maybe she didn't think it mattered anymore. He stood suddenly, the photograph still in hand, and crossed to the small trunk near the fireplace. It was old and wooden, the kind that carried more dust than secrets. He lifted the lid and pulled out a canvas pouch wrapped in twine. Inside were the only physical memories he'd kept. Dog tags, a letter from his mother, and a box of snapshots from another lifetime. He rifled through them, not looking for anything in particular, just needing to see faces again, evidence that once there had been a family. Laughter, joy, forgiveness maybe. Ash stirred by the door. Elias glanced over. The German shepherd had been silent this whole time, a living shadow, patient and watchful. But now he stood and padded over on quiet paws. Elias didn't say a word. Ash nudged his knee with his nose, then pressed the side of his head into Elias's thigh, firm, unmoving, like an anchor. The gesture undid something in him. He lowered his hand and rested it on Ash's head, fingers curling gently behind his ears. The dog didn't move, just stayed there, like he understood the shape of grief, and he knew in that moment, without question, that he hadn't just found a girl in the snow. He'd found his last chance at redemption. His voice, low and steady, cracked into the stillness. "I don't know if I deserve her, Faye, but I swear to you, I'll try." Ash closed his eyes and stayed where he was. And for the first time in a decade, Elias Rowe didn't feel alone in the cabin. The morning came slow, as if the sun itself was uncertain whether to rise. Outside the frost-glazed windows of the cabin, the world had been remade. A soft white sheet of snow blanketed everything from treetops to the worn wooden steps. Icicles clung like glass teeth beneath the roofline. The air was hushed, reverent, as though even the forest understood that something fragile inside was trying to mend. Lyra stepped barefoot from the bedroom, her steps quiet, deliberate. Her sweater hung off her frame like it didn't know her size yet. The scarf, her mother's scarf, was still around her neck, the only thing she clung to like breath itself. Ash and Nara trotted behind her, their nails clicking faintly against the hardwood floor. Elias stood in the kitchen, pouring hot water into a mug. The scent of chamomile drifted like warmth before the heat reached them. He turned slowly when he heard the soft shuffle of her steps. Lyra didn't speak at first. She simply looked around the room, eyes scanning the shelves lined with old books, worn tools, and hand-carved wooden figures that bore the quiet patience of a man who didn't often speak to others. She paused at a jar of dried lavender and touched it gently, as if half remembering something. Then, with her eyes lowered, she spoke. "Where's the bathroom?" Her voice was small, but not broken. Cautious, like someone unused to being allowed to ask questions. Elias nodded toward the far hallway. "Second door on the left. You'll see the mirror." Lyra gave the faintest nod, but before she turned, he saw it. The way her shoulders jerked slightly when he shifted his weight. A flicker of fear, so ingrained it had become muscle memory. He didn't say anything, just watched her walk, careful as a shadow. The day passed gently. Lyra stayed close to the dogs. She didn't explore far, just moved from one corner of the cabin to another, always keeping something solid between her and Elias. A chair, a wall, the back of the couch. She ate soup in silence, glancing out the window often, as if expecting the snow to turn black. When the evening fell, it did so quick. Time. Everything held. Until the sound. It was just a branch, brittle, wind-snapped, smacking against the frosted glass with a loud, jarring thud. But to Lyra, it was something else entirely. She woke with a start, breath caught in her throat. For a second, the room wasn't a room. It was a basement, a hallway, a closet. Somewhere without light. Somewhere no one listened when she cried. She rose quietly and stepped into the hallway, barefoot on the cold floor. Her silhouette was small, swallowed by the cabin's dark spine. Her hands trembled at her sides. She didn't speak, just stood there, eyes wide, heart racing in her ears. Elias had been half asleep on the couch in the living room, listening to the creak of the old firewood. But the soft shift of air told him something had changed, a silence too heavy. He stood carefully, walking toward the hallway without turning on a light. There she was, her back to the wall, the dogs flanking her, uncertain. Elias knelt slowly, so his eyes met hers at her height. He didn't speak, just waited. Lyra blinked, trying not to, but failing. She clenched her jaw tight like she'd been taught. No noise, no mess, no need, but her breath hitched anyway. "I thought I heard something." Her voice cracked down the center. It wasn't fear of ghosts or shadows. It was fear of memory, of the way the world sometimes reached back with a hand that looked too familiar. Elias didn't offer comfort, not the way people usually do. He didn't tell her she was safe, didn't say, "It's okay now." He didn't lie to her. Instead, he held out his hand, open, steady, quiet. Lyra looked at it, then at Ash. Then slowly, uncertainly, she reached out and placed her fingers in his palm. He didn't close his hand around hers, just let it be there, just enough to say, "I see you." "Come on," he said softly. "Back to bed. I'll sit a while." She nodded once, and together they moved back into the room. Ash returned to his post by the foot of the bed, and Nara curled once more near the door. The room was still dim, but not cold. Elias pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside her bed. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stayed, like a lighthouse through the storm. Lyra didn't fall asleep right away. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, eyes blinking slow. But eventually her breathing softened, her body uncurled, and when she drifted off at last, the scarf still clutched in her hand. Elias leaned back in the chair, watching the girl whose life had been folded into silence begin to unfold, just a little. Outside, snow kept falling, but beans by hand. heating oatmeal on the old stove. He didn't glance toward the guest room, but his ears stayed trained for sound. Since she'd arrived, Lyra rarely made any. She was a child who had learned how to disappear without leaving. But that morning, he heard the soft shuffle of feet, the faint creak of the floorboard just outside her door. When he turned, she was already halfway down the hallway, hugging a folded shirt to her chest, the same oversized sweatshirt from a night before, still clinging to her thin frame. Her hair was brushed awkwardly, like she had done it herself, but neat. Behind her, Ash stood at attention like a sentinel, and Nara trotted beside her, tail sweeping gently. "You can change in the bathroom," Elias said softly, gesturing with his chin, not wanting to startle her. "Take your time." She nodded. Quiet. She always nodded. But she didn't close the door all the way behind her, just enough for privacy, just enough to feel safe, but not so much that she would be alone in the dark. Elias turned back to the stove, pretending to focus on stirring oats. But when she emerged a few minutes later, tugging awkwardly at the sleeve of her shirt, he noticed it, just a flash beneath the hem of fabric, when her arm lifted to adjust the collar. A faint purple smudge. Then another, higher on her rib cage. Faded but unmistakable, the kind of bruise that came not from accident, but intent. His stomach turned, slow and heavy. Not from surprise, but confirmation. He'd seen enough during his years in the military. Children in war zones, displaced villages, bruises where no child should have bruises. But somehow this felt worse, because it had been allowed to grow in the supposed safety of a home. He didn't speak, didn't let his breath change, just gently ladled oatmeal into a bowl and set it on the table, placing it closer to her than usual. Lyra sat without a word. She pulled her sleeve down instinctively again, not realizing it had ridden up. Ash settled by her feet. Nara leaned her chin on Lyra's thigh. Elias stepped into the hallway and pulled out his old cell phone. He hadn't used it for anything but weather alerts and emergency calls in years. He scrolled through the list of saved numbers. There were only 4. He stopped at one. Maggie Wren. Dr. Maggie Wren wasn't just the town veterinarian. She ran the only informal outreach clinic for children who lived too far from hospitals or too close to trouble. She never asked questions she wasn't invited into. And she had a way of seeing things most adults chose to ignore. Elias stepped out onto the front porch, boots crunching softly in the fresh layer of snow. He hit call through the storm 2 nights ago with 2 shepherd pups. I found her under the old Pine Trail Bridge. The girl from the scanner alert? Maggie's voice tightened. Lyra? She's going by Lyra, but there's more to it. Another pause. Do I need gloves or gauze? Elias exhaled. Maybe both, but it's not bleeding. Not on the outside. He heard her keys in the background. Give me an hour. I'll say I'm here to check the pups. You know how to talk to her? She only speaks when it matters, so I listen. Good. Keep her warm. I'm bringing supplies. He hung up without goodbye. Maggie hated long goodbyes. Said they made people expect a return that didn't always come. When Elias stepped back into the cabin, Lyra had finished most of her oatmeal. Her fingers cupped the bowl like it was the only thing anchoring her in the room. Your dog's okay with visitors? He asked gently, crouching by the hearth to stir the embers back to life. She blinked. They don't bite. He smiled slightly, not at the words, but the fact that she'd said them. Maggie's coming, he added. She's a vet. Thought she could check them out, just to make sure they're all right. Lyra didn't answer. but her body softened just a little. She reached down to stroke Nara behind the ear. Then softly, so softly, it might have gone unnoticed. "She used to be a vet. My mom. Before." Elias turned from the fire slowly. "She sounds like someone who cared a lot." Lyra nodded, eyes still focused on the floor. "She said dogs can smell things we can't, that they know when you're not okay, even if you smile." Elias swallowed hard. Ash came over and placed his head gently on Lyra's lap. She whispered, "They knew something was wrong, before I did." Elias sat beside the fire, careful to keep the silence intact. It wasn't his job to fix what was broken. It was enough, for now, to be a space where something broken could rest. The morning snow had stopped falling by the time Elias pulled the old truck into the narrow gravel drive behind Wren's pet and farm clinic. The pines stood silent, cloaked in frost and time, and the wooden sign above the red door creaked gently in the breeze. Its painted letters faded but still legible. Lyra sat in the passenger seat, bundled in her scarf and Elias's oversized coat. Ash rested his chin on her thigh, while Nara lay curled against her boots, her breathing quiet but watchful. The engine idled low, heat pulsing from the vents like shallow breaths. Elias didn't speak. He let Lyra move at her own rhythm. After a moment, no other patients this early, just the scent of cedar shavings, faint antiseptic, and something older. Comfort, maybe. Familiarity. The kind of place where even silence felt held. Lyra didn't let go of the dogs. Her arms stayed around Ash's neck, one hand gently stroking Nara's ear. She barely lifted her gaze as they entered the exam room, a small space with soft lighting, wool blankets instead of paper, and a basket of old toys in the corner that hadn't been touched in months. Maggie crouched low, not reaching out. She let her voice meet the floor between them. "Mind if I check on these two first?" Ash looked at Lyra, then stepped forward without command. Just a quiet shift of weight and trust. Maggie smiled, murmured something low and warm, and ran her hands over his ribs, his paws, the back of his ears. "He's in excellent shape," she said to Lyra. "A little thin, but strong. Protective. He's imprinted on you. Probably always will be." Lyra nodded once. She still hadn't spoken. Nara came next, a softer creature, still puppyish in movement, but with a heart full of nerves. She trembled a little when Maggie touched her belly, but didn't pull away. "She sleeps next to me," Lyra said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. "When I wake up, she's always there." Maggie didn't look up from her exam. "That's how they love. Quiet, consistent." Lyra's lips pressed together. Her fingers dug into the scarf near her throat. When the dogs were done, Maggie stood, brushing her hands off on a towel. She looked to Elias, who gave the slightest nod, a silent agreement that it was time. "I'm also a people doctor," Maggie said, sitting gently on the bench across the room. "Not with a license, just with experience. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but I'd like to make sure you're okay." Lyra didn't answer. Ash sat beside her again. She buried her fingers into the thick fur around his neck. Would it help if the dog stayed close?" Maggie asked. Lyra nodded. "I can do that." She moved slowly. Everything about her was calm, intentional. No sudden shifts, no clinical coldness. Just a woman with weathered hands who had seen too much pain to rush healing. "I'm going to ask Elias to stay by the door. He won't go far." Elias stepped back, but stayed within reach. His presence in the doorway wasn't looming. It was steady, like the porch light left on through a storm. Maggie gently unwrapped the scarf from Lyra's neck. There were no visible marks, but her collarbones jutted a little too sharply. Her wrists were narrow, her hands cold to the touch. Maggie noted each detail quietly, saying nothing aloud. Then, as Lyra shifted her weight, the hem of her shirt lifted again, revealing the faint outline of a bruise. Questions, no assumptions. Lyra's lip quivered, just once, but she held her breath until the tremble passed. "I didn't tell anyone," she whispered. "I know." Maggie gently pulled the shirt back down, then rested her palm over Lyra's hand. "You're safe now. That matters more than anything else." Lyra's eyes filled slowly, but the tears didn't fall. She pressed her forehead against Ash's side, and he leaned into her. After a long moment, Maggie stood and stepped back. "No fever, no broken bones, but you need food, warmth, rest, and people who don't ask you to explain your pain." She turned to Elias. "Keep her here for now. I'll file nothing unless you ask me to." Elias gave a slow nod. "Not yet." Maggie leaned down, brushing a piece of hair from Lyra's face. "You don't have to be okay right away," she said softly. "You just have to stay." And Lyra, still curled beside her dogs, gave the smallest nod, a movement so small it might have been missed, but Elias saw it, and that was enough. The fire in the corner of the exam room crackled softly, sending flickers of light across the wood-paneled walls and catching in the glass jars neatly stacked on the shelves. Outside, a crow passed overhead, just a wing-beat and a shadow against the pale sky. And then, nothing but silence. Maggie stood at her desk, scribbling quietly into a faded manila folder. The pen in her hand didn't hesitate. Her notes were practiced, methodical, but her eyes, every now and then, drifted toward the bench, where Lyra sat, unmoving, wrapped in Elias's old coat, with Ash's heavy head resting on her knee. "Multiple bruises," Maggie murmured under her breath as she wrote, "some over a week old, ribs prominent, subclinical malnourishment, scars on the left forearm, inconsistent with childhood accidents." She paused, then wrote in firmer ink, "Suspected prolonged emotional neglect, possible physical abuse, extreme dependency on animals as primary emotional attachment." Elias leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, not in resistance but in effort. He wasn't used to standing still with his hands idle. His eyes stayed on Lyra, watching the way she clutched the dogs without even realizing it. There was a silence in the room that wasn't uncomfortable, just fragile. Like stepping into a chapel where someone is praying for something they don't know how to name. Maggie finally turned, her voice gentle but grounded. "Lyra, sweetheart, you don't have to talk if you don't want to. But if you want me to help keep you and your dog safe, it would help me to understand what happened." Lyra didn't look up. She ran her hand in slow circles over Ash's fur. Nara had crept up beside her now too, resting her chin across Lyra's ankle. Soft breath warming the cuff of her jeans. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of a page turning, and then, like breath through a crack in a closed window, Lyra whispered, "I wasn't fast enough." The words barely reached the air, but both adults heard them. Maggie didn't move. She waited. "I spilled orange juice," Lyra said. She spoke it like a confession, as if those 4 words held the weight of everything that had ever gone wrong in her life. Her voice didn't crack. It frayed, unraveling like an old thread on the edge of a memory she didn't want to carry, but couldn't forget. "He said I was useless," she added, still not looking at either of them, "that I didn't care about what people gave me." Her hand tightened in Ash's coat. "But I was trying to be careful. I didn't mean to." Elias inhaled sharply through his nose and turned his face slightly toward the wall, as if the grain of the wood might help him hold steady. Maggie stepped forward and knelt, not beside Lyra, but beside Ash. She stroked behind his ear once, gently, then looked up at Lyra. "No one should ever hurt you over orange juice," she said. Silence again. "He said I shouldn't cry," Lyra added, "that only babies cry." And with that a tear slipped down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it quickly with the back of her hand, wide and tired. The kind of tired that doesn't belong in someone so young. "Sometimes he says my mom wouldn't have wanted me." The room stilled. The logs in the stove cracked. Maggie swallowed hard, then nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood the shape of that kind of lie. The kind that leaves a scar deeper than fists ever could. "Your mother," she said slowly, "would be proud of how strong you are. She would be furious with what's happened, and she'd want you to be somewhere safe, somewhere where people don't break things that matter." Ash let out a low sound. Not a growl, not a whine, just a breathy, grounded noise. Protective. Present. Elias stepped forward now. He didn't speak, but he crouched near Lyra's side and placed something on the bench beside her, a small enamel cup filled with warm broth. "I made this," he said. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm." Lyra looked at the cup, then at him. "Can they drink too?" He smiled just a little. "I brought extra, for all three of you." She took the cup, both hands trembling slightly. She didn't drink, but she held it like it anchored her. Maggie watched them. The man with war still in his bones, the girl with frost in her silence, and the two shepherds who carried every unspoken word between them. This wasn't over. There were systems to navigate, reports to make, questions to face. But not now, not today. Today was for warmth, for listening, for letting the truth bleed gently into the room until it stopped feeling like a wound. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly, though no one had asked her for anything. Elias met her eyes. "You don't have to thank us for being on your side." Lyra nodded once, then leaned her head against Ash, closed her eyes, and let herself, just for a moment, rest. The last light of the day settled softly over the ridge line, like a shawl being drawn across the shoulders of the mountain. The trees stood hushed in the snow's hush, and from the front porch of the log cabin all the world felt muted, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except the fire inside. Elias had brought in extra logs that afternoon. The temperature was dropping again, the kind of cold that wasn't loud but crept beneath doors and under skin, curling like a ghost into old bones and quiet rooms. Lyra sat wrapped in a wool blanket, tucked into the corner of the old couch that had seen more years than either of them. The fire crackled in front of her, flickering against the worn wood floor and casting long, waving shadows on the opposite wall. Nara lay curled at her feet. Ash was pulling it tighter around her and stared at the flames. Her cheeks were still pale, and her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the fire. "If I had told someone, do you think I could have left earlier?" It wasn't just a question. It was something deeper, a wound shaped like wondering. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed locked on the fire as if afraid that turning away might make her words disappear. Elias let the question hang. He didn't rush to answer it. Some questions weren't meant to be patched, just held. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice soft, low, carrying the weight of knowing how heavy the word maybe could be. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked into the fire with her. "But sometimes," he added, "telling doesn't feel safe when no one's shown you what safe looks like." Lyra blinked slowly, absorbing that. "I used to think maybe I was just dramatic," she said, her tone uncertain. "That other kids had worse, that I should be grateful I had food." Her voice tightened at the word grateful, like it had been used against her too many times. Elias looked over. "You were surviving," he said gently. "That's not the same as being safe or being loved." The room fell still again. Outside, snow started to whisper against the windows, barely audible. "I used to dream about running away," Lyra murmured. "But I thought they'd come after me, that if I told, they'd say I was lying." She reached out and placed her hand gently on Nara's back. The dog stirred only slightly, sensing there was no danger, only memory. "I was scared of what would happen if I left," Lyra said. "But then I got more scared of what would happen if I stayed." Elias nodded slowly. "I know that kind of fear," he said. "I've seen it hollow out people." He looked into her face then, not just as a child, but as someone who had endured more than her age should hold. "You were brave, Lyra, even if it didn't feel like it." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. Her shoulders eased, but only slightly. The blanket shifted as she leaned back. "Will they find me?" she asked, and for the first time there was a tremor of letting the flames breathe deeper. "I lost someone once," he said after a long pause. "A long time ago. She thought she had to carry everything alone, too." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Lyra watched the way his hand tightened slightly on the poker. "I didn't know how to help her back then," he said, "but if I can help you now, then maybe something good can come of that." Lyra didn't answer. But she did something she hadn't done since she arrived. She let go of the blanket with one hand and reached toward Elias, just lightly. Her fingers brushed his sleeve and stayed there. A bridge, a beginning. The fire popped, sending up a brief shower of sparks. Ash opened his eyes and shifted closer. Elias looked down at her hand, then placed his over it, solid and warm. "Whatever comes next," he said, "you're not alone anymore." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to believe that might be true. The courthouse in Flagstaff looked older than its red brick, older than its stained oak doors or creaking floors suggested. It had the weight of history in its bones, the kind that made people walk quieter the moment they stepped inside. Snow melted off boots and coats, leaving pale puddles in the entryway. The wind had chased them all the way from the mountain. Inside courtroom 2B, the heat was uneven, too warm in some corners, too cold in others, but it was silence, not temperature, that drew the tension tight. Lyra sat on the wooden bench, feet not quite touching the floor, her back straight but not rigid. Ash was pressed into her side, his chin resting gently on her lap. Nara lay curled between her boots, tail flicking softly every few seconds, as if sensing the current in the room. Elias stood behind her, not too close, not too far. He wore a navy button-down, sleeves rolled at the forearm, the top button undone. He hadn't owned a suit in years, but he'd ironed the shirt carefully that morning with hands that had once learned to fold flags and carry caskets. It was enough. At the opposite bench, Monica sat with a confidence too rehearsed to be natural. Her burgundy coat matched her lipstick. Her heels clicked too crisply against the floor. She kept glancing toward the judge, her smile too careful, her jaw too tight. Beside her, Glenn slouched like someone who couldn't quite remember why he came, his thumb moving across his phone screen until a court clerk gave him a pointed look. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance. Everyone rose. Judge Catherine Reardon was a woman in her late 60s, silver hair coiled in a low, no raised voices and no condescension. This hearing is about the child's welfare, not anyone's pride. Monica crossed her legs, tight-lipped. Elias placed a hand lightly on the back of Lyra's seat, silent but grounded. "Ms. Monica Laird," the judge nodded toward her, "you may begin." Monica stood, voice sugar-slick. "Your Honor, I am Lyra's stepmother by legal marriage to her biological father, Glenn. While our household faced challenges, we always provided her with food, shelter, and education. I deeply regret any misunderstanding that led to her departure, and I am here to reclaim what is, by law, still our child." Elias watched Monica closely. Not a word of that sentence mentioned love. The judge raised a brow. "And Mr. Laird?" Glenn looked up from his lap, shrugged. "Yeah, I guess she should come home." There was a pause, not dramatic, just heavy, like the air chose not to move. Judge Reardon turned. "Mr. Elias Rowe." Elias stood slowly. "I'm not here to take someone's child," he said. "I'm here because Lyra came to me on a night when no child should be alone. She didn't run, she survived, and I have evidence to show the conditions she came from." He handed a folder to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. Inside were photos, bruises, notes from Maggie, a copy of Lyra's hospital band, the name Clara Faye Dawson circled in red, a photograph of Elias's sister. The judge flipped through slowly. "Are you a blood relative?" she asked. Elias hesitated. "I didn't know I was, until recently. Clara Faye was my sister. She vanished years ago. No one told me she had a daughter." "And you believe Lyra is that child?" He nodded. "I don't just believe it, I feel it, and I've watched her with Ash and Nara. Dogs don't fake loyalty." Lyra looked up at him then, just for a second, but it was enough. The judge turned to her. "Lyra, would you be willing to speak?" Lyra hesitated, then stood. Ash rose with her, as if tethered by something older than leash or command. Nara stayed at her feet. The room waited. Lyra looked at Monica, then Glenn, then turned away. "I wasn't safe there," she said simply. "Not in my body, not in my heart." She placed a hand on Ash's head. They didn't like the dogs. They didn't like my voice. They said I was too quiet to love. A soundless beat passed. But Elias, he didn't ask me to talk. He just listened. The judge leaned forward, eyes softer now. Reconvene in 2 weeks with a full review of guardianship and background confirmation. Until then, Lyra will remain in the temporary custody of Mr. Rowe. Monica stood sharply. Your Honor, I said no interruptions. Judge Reardon's voice cracked like thunder through the snow. Lyra reached back, and Elias let his fingers gently wrap around hers. The courtroom didn't cheer. No one clapped. But in that moment, something shifted. Not justice, not yet. But hope had stepped into the room, and it sat beside a girl who chose her name, her voice, and the man who never asked her to earn his love. The courtroom had begun to empty, papers were being gathered, the soft shuffle of chairs sliding back echoed between the worn wood walls and the hush of those unsure whether to speak. Elias stood near the bench, one hand resting gently on Lyra's shoulder. Her breathing had steadied, though her grip on Ash's ear hadn't loosened. Nara, ever vigilant, sat between her and the aisle, as if guarding her from history itself. Judge Reardon had not yet left the bench. Her gavel remained untouched. Something in her silence suggested she was waiting, listening beyond the spoken words. That's when a voice, small but steady, cut across the space like a candle lit in the dark. I have something to say. Heads turned. Elias looked toward the left side of the courtroom, and there, stepping out from behind her mother's chair, was Ivy, Monica's daughter. She was 10, maybe 11, red curls pulled back in a ribbon, her coat still buttoned wrong, her shoes too fancy for her slouched posture. She wasn't trembling, but her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, the way children do, when they're about to undo a lie. Monica's smile froze midair. Glenn looked confused. The judge leaned forward. Ivy? She asked. Voice softened by age and curiosity. Would you like to speak? Ivy glanced at her mother, then at Lyra, and chose courage. She stepped forward, voice small but piercing. Mama told me to hide the toy so Clara would be blamed. The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment the room stood still. A long, suspended silence, the kind that comes when everyone present realizes truth had been buried under polished shoes and polite lies. Monica jolted to her feet. Ivy, no, you misunderstood. I didn't, Ivy said firmly, not looking at her. It was the blue music box. She said, put it under Clara's bed. She won't know it's missing. And Glenn will believe you. And he did. Lyra didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She simply sat there, her eyes wide, her chin lifting just slightly, like a stem beneath a bloom long kept in shadow. Ash gave a soft whine. Nara turned her gaze to the girl now standing in the middle of the room, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Sarah, the court-appointed child advocate, finally snapped to her feet. This needs to be on record, she said. Your Honor. I'm listening, Judge Reardon replied, calm but unblinking. Monica's voice rose, brittle. She's confused. She's just trying to help her friend. I'm telling the truth, Ivy said, eyes now brimming. You always said Clara was in the way. You said she was weird and quiet and didn't know how to love people. But she did. She pointed at Lyra. She loved those dogs. She loved her mama. She gave me her last cookie once, even after I told on her for the juice. Glenn shifted uncomfortably, his silence now more damning than Monica's panic. Elias reached down. Lyra's fingers had begun to shake. He let her take his hand. Ivy, the judge said gently, can you tell me why you chose to speak now? Ivy swallowed. Because Clara... She paused, correcting herself. Lyra. She didn't cry when they yelled at her, not once. But she cried when her dog got kicked. I saw her, and I thought, someone should have cried for her too. The courtroom wasn't just quiet now, it was hushed in a different way. Like after snowfall, when the world pauses just long enough for something sacred to settle. Judge Reardon removed her glasses slowly. "Thank you, Ivy," she said. "You've done something very brave and very kind." Monica's mouth opened, then shut. Her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles paled. The judge looked toward the bailiff. "Please escort Ms. Monica Laird and Mr. Glenn Laird from the courtroom. I'll be speaking with both parties separately before any further hearings." Monica protested, but the weight of her daughter's words had already settled like a verdict. As they were led out, Glenn offered one last blank glance at Lyra. She didn't return it. Her gaze was fixed now on Ivy, the girl who once watched her be blamed, and now chose not to let it happen again. Elias knelt beside her. "You okay?" Lyra nodded, but her voice cracked for the first time since arriving in his world. She remembered the cookie. He nodded, and she remembered the truth. They sat there in the stillness, just a girl, her dogs, and the man who had once thought his cabin too broken to hold life again. But truth had a way of entering through cracks, like light, and today it had chosen the voice of a child to break what silence could no longer carry. The snow had started falling again by the time the courthouse doors opened. Fat, slow flakes drifted down from a sky the color of old pewter. They didn't bite the skin like ice, but rather settled on shoulders and sleeves, like something gentle that didn't quite belong here. Not outside a building where the last 2 hours had felt like war in whispers. Elias stepped through the doors first. His navy shirt, now lightly dusted with white, clung slightly to his back from the courtroom heat. Behind him, Ash's leash, the other buried in the oversized coat Elias had given her earlier, one that used to belong to his sister. The judge's words still lingered in his ears, like a bell tolling long after it's rung. "Temporary custody granted to Mr. Elias Rowe until further psychological and environmental evaluations are complete. He has demonstrated both capability and intention to provide a stable environment. The child will remain under protective observation. Further hearings scheduled next month." It was a formality, yes, but it was also the first time anyone had ever called him guardian. Elias didn't say much as they descended the steps, and Lyra didn't ask. Her face was pale against the rising collar of his coat, a few strands of dark hair escaping her scarf. Snow clung to her lashes, but she didn't blink it away. Instead, she looked out toward the parking lot, like someone unsure if they were being followed by ghosts or remembered by angels. Ash walked beside her, as steady as ever. Nara circled behind them, her tail swaying like a quiet metronome. When they reached the truck, the same beat-up Chevy that had once carried firewood and silence, Elias paused. His breath hung in the cold like a question. She looked up at him then, eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had once flinched at raised voices and sudden footsteps, but now they just waited for something, maybe permission, maybe a promise. He opened the passenger door, let Ash leap up first, then lifted Lyra gently under the arms and set her on the seat like she weighed less than the fear she carried. He closed the door softly, walked around, got in. Silence. The heater wheezed to life, groaning like old bones. Still, she didn't speak. Elias didn't either, not right away. But then his hand reached across the console, slow, no pressure, and rested beside hers, palm open. When she didn't pull away, he glanced at her and said, almost too softly to hear, "Lyra Fay." Her head turned, eyes widened, but not in fear, more like something unlatched inside her. A drawer long sealed. "You said that name in the kitchen once," she whispered. He nodded. "It was your mother's middle name, Fay. She blinked. She told me that once. Said it meant faith, or light, or something people forgot about but still needed. Elias nodded again. His throat tightened. I didn't forget, he said. I just didn't know she left part of herself behind. Lyra looked down at Ash, now asleep with his head in her lap. Then back up at Elias. Lyra fed, the snow thickening into soft sheets beyond the glass. He didn't cry. Not then. But his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, like he was holding on to something more fragile than he knew how to carry. Then that's who you are, he said. She leaned toward him then. Not fast, not bold, just slowly, carefully, like the body follows the heart when it starts to believe again. Her shoulder touched his arm. Her head found the corner of his coat. And for the first time in what might have been years, she let herself rest there. Not flinching, not folding in, just leaning. Outside, the snow kept falling, and with it, the last remnants of the girl who had once run away beneath a broken bridge. Inside, a name now had a place to live. The cabin had never known this kind of silence. Not the brooding, heavy hush that used to press against the windows like a storm held at bay, but a softer quiet now, warm and waiting, like the way a room settles just before someone comes home. Outside, the storm from the courthouse had passed, leaving behind a world washed in white. The trees stood wrapped in frost, and the porch creaked under the shifting weight of melting snow. Inside, Elias moved with something close to reverence. Barefoot on the old pine floor, the scent of cedar wood and faint paint still lingering in the air. Lyra trailed behind him, her small steps muffled by thick socks, and the bundle of Ash and Nara flanking her like twin shadows. She hadn't asked many questions on the ride home, just looked out the window with a stillness that didn't feel empty anymore, just watchful, alert, like someone who wasn't used to expecting good things, but maybe, just maybe, was starting to wonder if one might come anyway. Elias stopped outside the farthest door on the right. It had been shut for years. Once a storage room, then a catch-all for things he didn't want to face. Broken lamps, boxes of photos, memories wrapped in dust. But now the doorknob gleamed softly, polished and new. He looked down at her. Want to see something? Lyra gave the tiniest nod. He turned the knob. The door opened with a gentle creak, revealing a room bathed in early afternoon light. The walls were painted the softest shade of blue, not the bright, cheery kind from storybooks, but a quiet hue, like the sky just before dusk. Weathered stories, the window that looked out onto the pine trees. The coat hook hung low enough for her to reach. Her fingers tightened around Nara's leash. Then, barely above a whisper, "Can I keep it this color?" Elias smiled, not the wide kind, but the quiet one that began at the corner of the eyes and softened the whole face. "Anything you want." The words landed somewhere deep inside her, deeper than she expected, not just because they were kind, but because no one had ever said them before and actually meant them. She stepped into the room slowly, like she was afraid it might vanish. Ash trotted in first and did a slow lap, sniffing every corner. Nara padded to the bed and circled twice before curling up. Already home. Lyra stood in the center of the room, turning once, eyes wide, one hand reaching out to run along the edge of the desk. Smooth wood, lightly sanded, just enough space for a notebook, a lamp, a name. Her name. She said it out loud, softly like trying it on. Lyra Fay. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "Good name," he said. She turned, lips parting just a little. "It was hers, wasn't it? My mom." He nodded. Her middle name. She always said it meant hope. Lyra looked down. "Is that why you painted it this color?" "No," Elias said, honest. "Painted it because it felt right. But maybe that's why it felt that way." She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She walked over to the window and touched the glass. The cold met her fingertips like a reminder that outside was still winter, still sharp and unpredictable. But inside, there was a place now, a door, a name, a choice. She turned back to Elias, who hadn't moved, still watching her with a kind of patient awe, like someone trying to memorize a sunrise. "Will I have to leave?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not unless you want to." Another silence. Then, "Do you want to?" She stared at him. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Not big, not full, but enough that it lit something behind her eyes. "No," she whispered. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good," he said. Ash let out a low thump of his tail against the floor. Lyra crossed the room, pulled the quilt back, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Her fingers stroked the fabric like it was made of memory. Then she turned, looked at him again. "Can you leave the door open, just tonight?" Elias nodded. "As wide as you want." And he did always belong to her. The last light of the day drifted low through the windows, stretching thin golden bars across the floor like quiet music. The fire in the stone hearth crackled in soft rhythms, and for the first time since the storm that brought her here, the cabin didn't feel like borrowed space. It felt just enough, like hers. Lyra sat cross-legged on the rug near the fire, a colored pencil pinched tightly between her fingers. A page lay open in front of her. Not from a book or anything fancy, just an old notebook Elias had found tucked in a drawer, its cover faded and spine slightly frayed. She hadn't said much after dinner, just quietly asked if she could draw for a while. Elias had nodded, set down his coffee, and returned to whittling something by the window. He didn't speak either. He knew there were certain silences you don't interrupt. Ash lay curled beside her, head resting on his paws, occasionally glancing up at her with the kind of watchfulness that only a creature born for devotion could carry. Nara, smaller and still a little unsure in new spaces, paced once, then settled on Lyra's other side, leaning into her knee. The picture was simple. A house in the trees, 2 dogs, a small figure with a scarf drawn in soft green, and a sky dotted with stars, even though outside the sun had only just set. Elias watched from the corner of his eye. Her lines weren't hesitant. They were steady, not perfect, but deliberate. There was something in that. When the clock near the mantel clicked softly to 8 o'clock, Lyra looked up. "Can I feed them?" Elias nodded. "Their bowls are clean, scoops in the bag." She rose and padded to the kitchen. Ash followed like a shadow. Elias heard the sound of kibble filling metal bowls, the soft click as they were set down, and Lyra's voice, so quiet it was almost imagined, saying, "Eat slow this time. You don't have to rush." When she returned, her feet barely made a sound on the old wooden planks. She picked up her notebook, tucked it under one arm, and looked toward the hallway. "I think I'm ready," she said. Elias stood, stretching slowly. "Want the nightlight?" She hesitated. Then, "Just the hallway light." He gave her a small nod. "Deal." Together they walked down the corridor. Nara trotted ahead and flopped on her dog bed near the foot of Lyra's mattress. Ash curled up in the corner, eyes half closed but alert as ever. Lyra climbed into bed without a word. The quilt rustled around her like autumn leaves. Her drawing lay face down on the small nightstand beside her, her scarf draped over the edge of the bedpost like it had always belonged there. Elias pulled the edge of the blanket up a little from thought. It came from the kind of place people only speak from when they've lived through silence and loss and the weight of nights that never seemed to end. "You call my name," Elias said, "and I'll come." Lyra didn't nod. She didn't smile. She simply looked at him, eyes wide, searching, daring to hope, and whispered, "Okay." Elias left the door open. A crack of golden light spilled across the floor, casting a warm path that reached all the way to the foot of her bed. He didn't go far, just to the armchair near the fireplace, close enough to hear, close enough to return in an instant. The fire had settled into a soft glow, just embers now. Outside, the wind swept gently through the pines. No snow tonight, just stars unseen. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another, and for the first time since she could remember, Lyra Faye Dawson slept through the night. No startle, no breath held tight in her chest, no footsteps outside the door that made her heart race, no creak on the stairs that brought her fingers clenching the sheets. Just quiet, just the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, matched by the sleeping dogs at her side, and the soft echo of a voice she'd only begun to trust, still floating gently in her dreams. "You call my name, and I'll come." The cabin had settled into a stillness that only winter could teach, the kind of hush that spoke louder than noise. Logs popped softly in the hearth. The dogs lay like warm stones in their beds, and the faint rustle of blankets from down the hall told Elias that Lyra was still asleep, safe, unafraid, finally breathing easy. It was in this silence, beneath a flickering lamp and beside the waning fire, that he opened the small wooden box. The letter had lived there for years, unopened, yellowed slightly at the edges, folded with care, sealed in a plain white envelope, marked only with 2 words in delicate, looping ink: "For Elias." His hands trembled slightly as he slid his thumb beneath the flap. He'd avoided this moment for so long, told himself it was too late, that it wouldn't change anything. But tonight, with Lyra's laughter still faint in his memory and the sound of her whisper, "You call my name and I'll come," echoing like an answered prayer, he couldn't run anymore. He unfolded the paper, and Faye came back. "Dear Elias, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I deserve for you to. But I had to write it, just once, while my hands still remembered how to tell the truth. I'm sorry for the fight, for leaving, for letting silence take root between us when we should have been each other's shelter. I didn't leave because I hated you. I left because I didn't know how to ask you to stay. There are things I should have told you, things I couldn't. Her name is Clara. She's mine. I never wanted you to find out like this. But if you're holding this letter, maybe that means you found her. Or that somehow she found you. She's light, Elias, gentle, in ways I never was. She looks at the world like it still has kindness left, like it might open its arms if she just waits long enough. I've been running too long, hiding too much, but not from her. She deserves more than what I've given. If I don't make it, If life swallows me before I can fix this, I'm begging you, protect her. The way you once protected me. Forgive me. And if you can't, just hold her hand. Love always. Faye. Elias sat in the stillness for a long time. No tears, not yet. Just a long, aching breath that seemed to climb from somewhere deeper than lungs. The fireplace hissed as a log settled. The letter fluttered slightly in his grip, like it, too, had something more to say. He didn't reread it. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every line. He rose slowly, crossed the floor barefoot, and knelt by the fire. His fingers hesitated for a second. Then, gently, like tucking away an old photograph, he let the letter fall into the flames. It curled at the edges first, ink bleeding as if weeping into the paper. Then the name, then the words, until nothing remained but light and ash and silence. He whispered, not to the letter, but to the air, to the girl sleeping down the hallway, to the sister whose memory was stitched into every shadow of this cabin. She lives in Lyra now. It wasn't grief that filled him, not exactly. It was something quieter, a slow acceptance, a beginning folded inside an ending. In the hallway, one of the dogs stirred, a soft shuffle of paws, then stillness again. Elias stood. He turned the lamp low, stoked the fire once more, and cast one last glance toward the fading embers. Then he walked quietly to the doorway of Lyra's room. She was asleep, curled on her side, scarf still knotted gently at her throat. One hand rested near Nara's back. Ash had moved closer to her pillow, his breathing deep and even. Elias didn't step inside. He just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes soft, and for the first time in nearly a decade, he whispered words into the night that didn't belong to ghosts, but to the living. Thank you, Faye. I'll keep her safe. The first signs of spring arrived not with fanfare, but with soft changes, the kind only quiet hearts noticed. A breeze that no longer bit at the skin, the rhythmic drip of melting snow, moss reawakening at the base of pines. Sleeves were rolled high, fingers smudged with paint and dirt. She didn't mind. It was something she could shape with her hands. Ash sat alert by the gatepost. Nara lounged in a patch of sun. The dogs had grown like she had, grounded now, not watchful out of fear, but out of trust. The cabin door creaked open. Elias stepped out with 2 steaming mugs. She's almost prettier than the house now, he said, nodding at the fence. Lyra took the tea, smiling faintly. She deserves it. She held up through a lot. The fence. And me. He chuckled. That you did. They sipped their drinks in silence as birds chirped overhead. The first time they'd heard birdsong without snow. Want to take a break? Elias asked. I already walked to the cedar ridge. We saw 2 deer. You beat the sunrise today. She nodded. I like walking before the world wakes up. It's like everything's mine for a little while. Elias understood. Come here. I want to show you something. Inside, he reached above the fireplace and pulled a tin case from behind old books. Inside, a harmonica, worn, engraved Fr. Pharaoh. It was hers, he said. She played every Sunday, drove me crazy. Lyra reached for it, then paused. He handed it to her. She'd want you to have it. I don't know how, I'll teach you." They sat by the hearth. Elias showed her how to breathe through it, not into it. Her first notes were thin, unsure, but she kept going. "You've got lungs," he said. "Now let's find your rhythm." Like painting? Exactly like that. That night, the harmonica lay beside a drawing. Two deer nestled beneath cedar trees. Lyra shaded the sky behind them in river pebble blue. In the span of a season, she had gone from trembling to trying, from hiding to hoping. Elias leaned back, eyes closed. Outside, a fox called from deep in the thawing woods. The forest was changing, and so was she. The attic door had always creaked like a throat before confession. Elias hadn't gone up in 5 years, not since trying to pack away memories. But that morning, Lyra had seen the light from the ceiling panel and asked, "What's up there?" And he didn't say no. Dust swirled in the attic, like it had been waiting. Elias opened a small window. Sunlight cut across old boxes. He pulled one close. The label read, "Faye, 2007-2009. "That's my mom?" Lyra asked. He nodded. Inside, birthday falling apart. You were the part she held on to. Lyra's fingers trembled. Was she scared? Maybe, but more than that, she was determined. She held one photo longer than the rest. Faye, eyes closed, resting her forehead gently to her belly. "Can I keep this one?" Elias nodded. Of course. They carried it downstairs. She didn't let it go. In her room, she cleared a space on her bedside table. The harmonica lay nearby, a painted rock, a copy of The Secret Garden, and now the photo of her mother by the lake. Ash settled beside the bed. Nara curled up nearby. Elias stood at the door. Lyra looked up. She was real. She was. And she wanted me. Every day. She rested her hand gently on the frame. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the girl who once flinched in silence now slept with one hand on a photograph, as if holding something that, finally, wouldn't be taken from her. The morning was soft. Not because of weather, the wind still rattled the shutters, but because of something quieter. Lyra sat cross-legged on her bed, a leather journal in her lap. She had never owned one before. Elias had left it on her pillow with no note, just, "It's yours if you want it." She opened to the second page. The first had her name, Lyra Faye Dawson. "I'm keeping both." She wrote, "Uncle Elias never locks the door, not to my room, not to his arms." The words surprised her, not because they were hard, but because they came so easily. Like leaves falling gently onto water. She looked around. Ash slept beside her. Nara curled near the dresser. Everything in the room breathed calm. She opened her nightstand drawer, her safe things, the photo of her mother, the harmonica. A pine cone, Elias said, looked like a cathedral, a green ribbon from Maggie, this journal. She pressed her palm to the wood, sealing it like a promise. Downstairs, the kettle whistled. Cabinet doors thudded. The old radio hummed faintly. These sounds didn't startle her anymore. She no longer flinched at footsteps or shrank when Elias raised his voice to call the dogs back in. She padded down the stairs, past the hallway closet. Once she had hidden in closets, silent behind coats, breath held. But this door stood slightly open, harmless. She let it be. In the kitchen, Elias poured tea. "Peppermint okay?" She nodded. He motioned to the porch. "It's warm enough now." They stepped into the morning. The swing moved gently in the breeze. She sat beside him. No blanket, no barrier. I wrote something today, she said. He didn't turn, just let the moment settle. I wrote that home isn't a place. It's when someone doesn't lock the door behind them. That's a good line, he said. The door open. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The wind carried pine and sap. The sky stretched wide and honest. Do you think she'd be proud of me? Elias didn't hesitate. She already is. The swing creaked. The dogs breathed quietly at their feet. Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder, and inside her, where old wounds once lived, something began to root. Not all scars fade, but some become the outline of something stronger. The meadow had softened. Snow melt whispered under moss, and pine needles no longer crunched. They gave like the forest exhaling after a long-held breath. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. Once a small orchard, it had turned wild with thistle and thyme. But now, with sun on his shoulders and Lyra's laughter in the air, it no longer felt empty. Ash chased a moth lazily. Nara watched near the fire pit. Lyra knelt at the stone circle, peeling bark from a cedar branch, brow furrowed in thought. Elias approached. Starting a woodworking shop? She grinned. Maybe? He crouched beside her. What if we built something here? A place not just for us, but for kids like you, and dogs like Ash and Nara. A place to rest, to remember they matter. Lyra froze. A sanctuary, he continued, not a shelter, where healing isn't a miracle, it's expected. She swallowed. You'd let other kids come here? Not live, just stay, long enough to feel safe, like you do. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out the wood-burning pen Maggie gave her and etched 2 words into the cedar plank. Riverlight Refuge. It's not just the river, she said quietly. It's the light that came back. He nodded. He understood. The next day, they cleared the orchard. Ash dragged sticks into a pile like it was his first job. Nara guarded the cedar sign. Elias hauled lumber. Lyra measured boards, her handwriting now on plans pinned to the cabin wall. They painted the tool shed, marked out garden rows, and built kennels, not cages. Soft straw, wooden beams, no bars. Each dog gets a name, Lyra said, brushing sawdust from her sleeve. And a blanket, Elias added. And each kid gets to pick theirs. Even if it's weird, especially if it's weird. That night, marshmallows sagged over the fire, stars cracked open the sky, and Elias asked, You really think we can do this? Lyra nodded toward the sign in her lap. You said hurt turns quiet. Maybe this place helps it speak again. He looked at her. Not just healing, but becoming. Someone who dared to name things. The crate he could barely lift his head. Lyra came barefoot that evening, with only a blanket and a quiet hum. The tune Elias taught her on the harmonica. No words, just warmth. Hours passed. When Elias returned from the fence line, Echo was curled beside her, eyes open. You hear things different, she whispered. But I do too. Then came Moose, a massive St. Bernard rescued from a junkyard. Flinching, growling in his sleep, Elias wasn't sure they were ready, but when Moose locked eyes with Bear, the black shepherd now guarding the gate, something passed between them. Not challenge, recognition. Lyra stood back, watching. He needs to know we won't ask anything from him until he's ready. And Nara, beside her, leaned in like she agreed. Within a week, Riverlight felt old in the best way. Dogs came and went, some stayed. Echo still hovered near the porch. Lyra burned names into planks of wood and lined them like a growing family tree. The porch smelled of peanut butter treats and pine. Blankets dried on the rail. Wind chimes made from bottle caps clinked softly. But what mattered most were the silences, when Moose didn't bark as someone passed, when Echo took 3 steps off the porch, when Pepper didn't flinch at a touch. At night, Bear and Nara walked the perimeter, not because they had to, because they chose to. Late one afternoon, Lyra sat beneath the willow tree with her journal, Pepper's head in her lap, Echo at her feet, Moose snoring nearby. She drew scars, a missing claw, a crooked leg, a burn, then beside each, a bloom. From the limp paw, a sunflower. From the crooked leg, a sapling. From the burn, morning glories. When Elias found her there, she smiled. Not big, but full of peace. "You okay, kiddo?" "I think they're okay now," she said. "I think they're better because of you." She didn't reply, just pointed at the horizon. "There's more coming. I can feel it." Elias nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Just after 9 a.m., the sign Lyra burned, Riverlight Refuge, was hung by the gate. Wind moved through the grass. Birds called from the eaves. Elias adjusted his collar. He wasn't used to speeches. But this wasn't about polish. It was about opening doors. Lyra sat on the steps between Ash and Nara. She wore a lavender scarf, not for fashion, but because it reminded her of skies that didn't shout, but waited. Visitors came slowly. Teachers, ranchers, a barista with dog biscuits, parents holding shy children, children gripping leashes. Then Ivy arrived, ponytail messy as ever, grinning. She ran straight to Lyra. "You said I could come when it was ready." 11 sharp, Elias stepped under the willow. The welcome bell clanged. He cleared his throat. "Most of you know me. If you don't, that's okay. I'm Elias Ward. This place wasn't my idea, not really. It was hers." He nodded to Lyra. "I just built the fence. She built the heart." A pause. "Riverlight is for anyone who's needed space, silence, or fur," he said, smiling. "We don't ask what broke you. We just help you walk again. One paw, one step, one breath at a time." He looked out at the children and dogs. "This isn't a shelter. It's a beginning." Applause didn't roar. It rippled soft, like wind through pine. Lyra didn't speak. She didn't need to. She tied welcome ribbons on each dog, showed nervous twins how to brush Echo, sat beside Moose when noise overwhelmed him. Then it happened. From a van, a golden puppy broke free, a blur of fur and joy. He bolted through the grass and leapt straight into Lyra's lap, licking her chin like he'd waited his whole life for her. She gasped, then she laughed, not softly, not politely, a full, free laugh. People turned. Elias froze mid-sentence. It was the laugh of a girl who hadn't known she could make that sound. Ash barked. Nara pressed into her side. The puppy wriggled victorious. "You picked me," she whispered, holding him close. As the sun tilted west, Elias stood on the porch watching her show a boy how to read the wooden name signs. "She reads them all," Ivy said beside him. "Even the hard ones." "She remembers what matters," Elias replied. "Yeah," Ivy smiled. "She always did." Riverlight wasn't just open. It was alive, and between the wind, the laughter, and paws crunching gravel, something had taken root, not just hope, but belonging. The pine had stood longer than most people in the county had lived. Its trunk bent slightly toward the west, branches stretching like open arms over the far edge of Riverlight Refuge, where the wind passed untouched. Lyra had passed it many times since the snow thawed, but today she stopped. Ash trotted beside her. Nara followed, slower now, but steady. In Lyra's hands, wrapped in cloth, was a photograph, not framed or sealed, just held. Late afternoon light filtered gold through the trees. A bell at the gate rang once, faint and far. Elias had stayed behind. He knew this moment belonged to her. Lyra knelt by the pine roots. The soil was soft, dry. She opened the cloth gently. It was a photo of a woman barefoot, laughing at the lake's edge, visibly pregnant, hair wild in the wind, hands resting on her belly as if cradling something not just precious, but chosen. She had no one to take it, Elias had said when they found it to stay. She looked up through the pine needles, sky peeking blue between green. I know now. You always wanted me. Ash leaned against her. Nara settled into the moss. I used to be scared of everything, she said, of the dark, of being blamed, of making noise, of being me. A pine needle spun in the wind. She touched it lightly. But I'm not scared anymore. The wind rustled above, not an answer, not silence, just presence. From her pocket she placed a painted river stone at the base of the photo. A small yellow sun marked its surface. She didn't bury the photo. She wanted it seen, left, right, and when she stood, she didn't look back. As they walked back, Elias met her part way. She met his eyes. It's done. He nodded once, as if something deep in him had just exhaled. That night, not a single dog barked after sundown. The sky was clear, the wind was warm. By midday, the new boy had arrived, thin shoulders in an oversized corduroy jacket, fingers tapping the seams like he was holding in static. His name was Avery, 8, nearly 9, too quiet, eyes too quick. Beside him sat a crate. Inside, a wiry puppy trembled, curled in the corner. The boy avoided eye contact. His hands never stopped moving. Lyra saw it all, not just him, but the stillness, the crate. She walked over slowly, Ash beside her, Nara like a silent shadow. She didn't greet the adults. She knelt in the grass and spoke only to the pup. Hi. Then she sat, waited. Ash curled beside her. Nara joined, quiet and calm. The boy watched. They don't come out when they're scared, she said, soft as smoke, and they don't like loud. Still she didn't look at him. After a long pause, the boy crouched beside her. His fingers slowed, not still, but gentler. The pup gave a small whine. Can you hear it? She asked. He nodded. They whisper at first, she said, to see if anyone's listening. His eyes glistened. He blinked fast. You want to try? She asked. He hesitated, then reached out, unlatched the crate. The door creaked open. The puppy didn't move. She's watching, Lyra said, seeing if we're safe. Ash nudged the boy's leg. Hold out your hand, she said. Don't move it. Just let her see. The boy obeyed. The wind shifted. A robin called. The sun warmed the dirt. Then a mottled nose appeared. The puppy stepped forward, belly low, one paw, then another. She sniffed, nudged the boy's hand, and curled beneath it. The boy didn't speak, but he didn't look away. She likes you, Lyra said. He whispered, she's not scared of me? She was, she said. She still is, but not enough to stay hiding. He nodded, slowly, like something inside had shifted. She just needs to be seen, she added. Like you? He asked. She smiled. Yeah, like me. They sat that, curled protectively around something warm and alive. Elias watched from the porch, said nothing. Inside, someone boiled tea. Ivy drew chalk hearts on the path. The world moved gently here. And under that Arizona sky, a frightened boy stayed still just long enough for something broken to come close. The envelope arrived in the afternoon mail, plain manila, ordinary. Elias held it like it was made of glass. He didn't open it right away. That evening, as the sky turned gold behind the ridge, he stepped into the cabin. Lyra sat by the hearth, rubbing Nara's ears, pencil sketching in soft loops. He held up the envelope. Her eyes widened. She set the pencil down. He sat beside her. The fire popped. This is yours, he said. She opened it slowly. Steady hands. Inside, a single sheet. Guardianship granted to Elias Rowe. Name change approved. Lyra Faye Rowe. She stared at the page. then traced the name at the bottom with her thumb. Lyra Fay Rowe, she whispered, trying it on like a coat that finally fit. You kept her name, Elias said quietly. Lyra nodded. So I remember where I came from. She looked at him. And I kept yours. So I know where I'm going. His breath caught. Ash nudged her knee, sensing what had taken root. Lyra opened a small wooden box. Inside, a black harmonica, engraved by hand. A framed photo of her mother by the lake. Bear's old dog tag, still polished. And now, the certificate. She placed the page inside, closed the lid with both hands. I think I'm full now, she said softly. Full? Like a circle. Before, I was missing something I couldn't name. Now I know what it is. He said nothing, just placed a hand gently on her back. They sat that way, firelight on wood, silence wrapped around them like quilt seams. Later that night, Elias turned off the porch light and saw her through the cabin window, at her desk. Box beside her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. She just looked whole, and that was enough. By the time the first leaf blushed red on the ridge, Riverlight Refuge had become more than Elias ever dreamed. Once a quiet cabin with one girl and 2 dogs, it now pulsed with new names, tentative footsteps, and the soft thud of paws on soil. It started with Wyatt, a teen from Prescott, who didn't speak much. But when Pepper, the 3-legged spaniel, limped to his side, he reached out like he'd been waiting his whole life for something that didn't flinch. Then May came, 11 years old, so quiet she barely stirred the grass. Moose drooled on her lap, and she cried. This, she told May, guiding her hand. They stood before the western wall of the cabin, painting a mural Lyra had once whispered to Elias as a dream. He'd handed her an old tackle box. Go for it. Now winding gray trees rose from the wood, their canopies gold and emerald. Paw prints danced between the trunks. Constellations arced above, boots beside a bone, a dog curled around a child, a heart made from hands and paws. Ash had added his print, dipped in non-toxic paint. Nara's came next, firmer, like her place in their lives. Above them, Lyra painted a tiny open door. No lock, just light. When Mateo asked what it meant, she simply said, "It's what I never had." Volunteers came too, drawn by whispers in quiet online posts. Tasha, whose son had battled grief, taught the kids to garden. Flowers don't ask questions when you cry, she said, but they grow better when you do. Lyra listened to her pauses as much as her words. She had learned silence carries shape, and shape carries weight. Elias watched from the porch. Lyra helped Wyatt untangle Echo's leash. She didn't correct him when he flinched. She just held still. They just need to be seen, she had said once. Now, she was helping others be seen too. That evening, as twilight turned the pines to silhouettes, Lyra stepped back from the mural. Near the top, she'd burned a plaque into the wood. Riverlight Refuge, where broken things grow roots. Ash and Nara sat at her feet. Moose snored under the lilac. Pepper blinked, then tucked her nose under her paw. Elias approached quietly. "It's more than I ever imagined," she said. He looked at the wall, the field, the kids chasing dogs through sunset light. "So are you." She didn't answer. She just leaned into his side as stars bloomed overhead. The cabin used to echo, soft paw steps, the crackle of firewood, grief that moved like mist. But tonight, the walls were full. Chairs scraped, forks clinked, someone spilled cider. Nobody minded. The long pine table groaned under stew, mashed potatoes, and roasted squash. Maggie's recipe had taken a detour into, just see what happens. Ash barked indignantly when Nara snatched a dropped carrot. Laughter exploded. Even Elias laughed, full, deep, loud. Lyra watched from across the table. Spoon paused mid-air, her eyes bright. This was new, not just joy, shared joy. "Uncle Elias," Ivy called from near the fire. "Was that cinnamon or chili powder in the apples?" Elias grinned. "Guess you'll know when your mouth sweats." Groans, a napkin thrown. Bear, now semi-retired, caught it mid-air and shredded it. The room broke again. Later, dishes stacked. The group drifted to the living room. Ash curled near the hearth. Nara lay with her head on Leo, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. Ivy close enough to nudge Lyra's arm. Lyra raised the harmonica. A breath, then a note uncertain, warm. The music floated up like smoke, not perfect, but full of soul. A tune between lullaby and memory. No words, but everyone understood it. Elias recognized it. His mother's old melody. Carried forward, softened, changed, alive. Then, Lyra sang. Quiet, trembling, then stronger, each line steadier. Maggie wiped her eye and blamed dust. Ash lifted his head. Firelight painted Lyra in gold. Her hair, longer now, tucked behind her ear. Her voice, untrained but true. "I didn't know she could sing," Ivy whispered. "Neither did she," Elias murmured. When she finished, no one clapped, not from awkwardness, but reverence. Elias walked to the fire, knelt, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned in, not for reassurance, but because she knew she didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. The sky held its breath. Silver light dusted the pines. Frost clung to shadow. Lyra walked alone through the woods behind the cabin. Ash stirred when she'd pulled on her coat. Nara stayed curled beneath the quilt. She didn't want company. The pine stood tall, older than the cabin, perhaps older than grief itself. It had weathered storms by choice, it seemed. At its base lay the photo. Her mother, barefoot by the lake, pregnant and glowing. Lyra knelt, bare hands pressed to earth, cool but not biting. She sat in silence, just breathing. "Thank you for choosing me," she whispered. The wind stirred the needles overhead, not in reply, but in witness. She smiled, not to seem okay, because she was. A pine cone dropped beside her hand. She picked it up. Once it would have felt like a message she didn't deserve. Now it felt like being seen. She set it beside the frame. "Wherever you are," she said, "I hope you know, I don't blame you anymore." Light filtered through the branches. "You left before I knew you, but somehow, I still knew you anyway." She paused. "I used to think love had to hurt, that it meant shrinking, staying quiet, but now I know." Another breath. "Love means showing up, staying soft, letting someone come home, even if they're late." A bird stirred overhead. Lyra smiled again. "I'm not scared anymore." She rose slowly, didn't pocket the pine cone. She didn't need to carry everything anymore. She walked back. He nodded to the mug he'd set out. "It's got your name on it." She poured a cup, stirred in cream. Calm, steady, like someone who belonged. "You all right?" Elias asked. She looked toward the trees. "I think I finally said everything I needed to say." He passed her the sugar without another word. Later, she would play the harmonica again. Later, Ivy would ask for help repainting the barn. Later, she'd teach Mateo to braid collars from scrap. But for now, she just sat at the table. fingers warm around the mug. Ash rested his head on her knee, and for the first time she could remember, the quiet didn't feel like waiting. It felt like home. In a world that moves too fast, there's something sacred about the quiet loyalty of a dog, especially a German shepherd so fiercely protective, so deeply feeling. Their devotion isn't loud. It shows up in the stillness beside your chair, in the way they check the room before settling, in the knowing glance that says, "You're not alone." Stories like this remind us that love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens, and sometimes it waits. If this story touched something in you, maybe it's time to look at your own four-legged companion with fresh eyes. There's a bond there, a history, even if unspoken. If you're curious about ways to deepen that connection, I've come across a gentle resource that some friends have found meaningful. Nothing fancy, just thoughtful ways to understand your dog a little better. You can find it at the link below, if your heart leads you there. Whatever you choose, just know this: to your dog, you are already enough. And sometimes, that's all any of us really need to hear.